Welcome, everyone. This is YIVO Institute Max Weinreich Center Fellowship Lecture. Today's lecture is that in the Fellowship of Jewish Arts, Music, and Theater. Our lecturer today is Paula Ansaldo, who is the recipient of the Ruth and Joseph Kremen Memorial Fellowship. The Kremen family is are those that funded the fellowship, and we thank them kindly for doing so. Paula Ansaldo, who holds a PhD in History and Theory of Arts from the University of Buenos Aires. She's a postdoctoral research fellow at the National Council for Technical and Scientific Research of Argentina and the Institute of Performing Arts, UBA, and a member of the Center of Jewish Studies. She teaches history of theater too in the Department of Arts at the Faculty of Philosophy and Literature, UBA. She has co-published the book Independent Theater, History and Present and Perspectives on Theater Directing, Theory, History, and Poetics, as well as several articles on the history of Jewish theater in Argentina and in academic publications of the US, Spain, Brazil, France, Mexico, Chile, Peru, Poland, and Argentina. In addition to receiving grants from CONICET, Fordham University, New York Public Library, Coimbra Group Universities, American Philosophical Society, and Latin American Jewish Studies Association, she is also the recipient of the 2021-2022 Ruth and Joseph Kremen Memorial Fellowship in East European Arts, Music, and Theater at the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research. Her lecture today is entitled Yiddish Theater in South America, 1930 to 1960, Transnational Networks and Artistic Exchange. And I would just like to remind everyone, if you do have questions, kindly put them in the Q&A section of the Zoom, not the chat. And thank you all for attending. Please welcome Paula Ansaldo.
Thank you, Eddie, for the introduction, and thank you all for being here today and for your interest in the history of Yiddish theater in South America. This research is part of my postdoctoral project that I'm just beginning, so this is the early stage of my research, which is very exciting. My doctoral thesis was devoted to the history of Jewish theater in Buenos Aires between the 1930s and the 1960s. So for my postdoctoral research, I wanted to expand my investigation to a wider region, taking a comparative theater perspective. So now my focus is on South America. I have deeply enjoyed working at YIVO Archives, and I would like to use this opportunity to thank everyone at YIVO and Eddie and everyone at the Center for Jewish History for their help and support during my visit. So today I'll present you with an overview of the development of Yiddish theater in South America, focusing mainly on Argentina and Brazil. I'm going to share my presentation with you now. Okay. There you go. So, as you probably already know, during the interwar period, a large population of Yiddish-speaking Jews settled in South America, escaping difficult living conditions and anti-Semitism in Europe. Thanks to this, the region developed a rich Yiddish cultural life, and its major cities like Buenos Aires, Sao Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, Santiago de Chile, and Montevideo, they became attractive destinations for Jewish intellectuals and artists. For most Jewish immigrants, attending the theater was already a regular cultural practice, since by then, Yiddish theater companies were performing all over Europe. So in the new countries they arrived to, Yiddish theater functioned as a meeting place where Jewish immigrants could share the Yiddish language and deal with the feeling of longing for the old home. The local theater in Spanish or Portuguese could not fulfill that function due to the language barrier and the representation of topics that had nothing to do with the experiences of the Jewish immigrants. For those reasons, most Jews did not attend the national theaters and developed instead their own local theater circuit. The South American Yiddish theater scene experienced its heyday between the 1930s and the 1950s. During those years, theater in Yiddish had a regular and enthusiastic audience, and the most renowned European and American artists of the Yiddish theater began to include South American cities in their international tours. At the same time, a series of changes taking place in the international sphere contributed to positioning South America, and especially Buenos Aires, as a central theatrical node of the Jewish theater world. By the 1930s, Yiddish theater audiences in the US and Europe were starting to decline, so actors increasingly toured countries where theater in Yiddish thrived, as was the case in South American cities. The Southern Hemisphere had an extra advantage. It benefited from the season's opposition, so the European and American actors could work the winter season in South America during their summer break, without the need to leave their own companies altogether. This way, they were able to do 2 winter seasons, one in the US, based in New York, and another one in South America, based in Buenos Aires, from where they also tour other South American cities. To give you an idea, a typical tour, a gastrol of a Yiddish actor of the time would include performing in Buenos Aires, and then moving on to Montevideo in Uruguay, and the Brazilian cities of Sao Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, and Porto Alegre. Longer trips might also include a tour of the Argentinian provinces like Córdoba, Santa Fe, Entre Rios, and of course the Jewish agricultural colonies, and then a trip across the Andes to perform in Santiago de Chile. I'm going to show you some archival image to illustrate it. Many of these materials come from Ivo archives and were part of the collections of the Yiddish actors who kept a record of their performances. So since the beginning of the Yiddish theater in South America, the arrival of guest artists from the US and Europe was a fundamental component of the theater season. The city of Buenos Aires, which since the 30s was one of the world's main centers of Yiddish culture, became the theater capital of the region. The guest stars visits were organized mainly by Argentinian-based impresarios who brought the foreign stars from abroad to lead their companies and then filled out the cast with local actors, organizing what became known as a star system. Each year, every impresario brought 3 or even 4 stars who performed with the company for a few weeks or months until the next star arrived from abroad and take the leap. This way, the multidirectional migratory movement of European Jews during the interwar period and the internationally used language of Yiddish contributed to the creation of an extensive transnational network of Yiddish artists, which allowed them to perform throughout the world. Thanks to this system, many renowned Yiddish artists like Moritz Schwartz, Jacob Benami, Joseph Bulov, Molly Picon, among others, performed during those years in South America. Here you can see some other theater posters. You can see Moritz Schwartz, Molly Picon, Jacob Benami performing in Buenos Aires and in Rio de Janeiro. So I'm going to try to paint you a picture of how the South American Yiddish theater scene functioned, focusing on the Buenos Aires case, which was the biggest and the most developed Yiddish theater center in the region, and is the one that I know the best. But from what I have seen so far, the phenomenon was quite similar in Sao Paulo, Rio, and Montevideo, but on a smaller scale. So during the golden era, which is between the 30s and the 50s, 5 theaters regularly showed plays in Yiddish in Buenos Aires. The Soleil and the Excelsior in the neighborhood Abasto, the Mitre in Villa Crespo, and the Ombú and the Ift in Once. In addition to the theaters, cafés like El Cristal and El Internacional also presented Yiddish vaudeville numbers, creating a wide Yiddish theater scene. In Buenos Aires, shows were performed from Tuesday to Sunday with 2 or even 3 performances on weekend, and the season lasted approximately from April to November. Between November and March, companies were formed for touring the Argentinian provinces and other South American cities. This way, the local actors could work during the summer months. Remember, we are in the Southern Hemisphere, so the summer months are between December and March. And this is the time when most theaters were closed and no foreign stars were coming to perform in the country. So the cities of Montevideo and Porto Alegre were close enough to Buenos Aires to substantially benefit from this phenomenon, so they receive a lot of Argentinian theater troupes during the summer. Most Ashkenazi Jews went to the Yiddish theater, from immigrants who had recently arrived in the country to Jews who had already been living in South America for many years, from working class to wealthy Jews and those who were part of the middle class. According to testimonies from the period, within the Jewish community, going to a theater was considered as an outstanding event that was eagerly expected throughout the week. According to Moshe Korin's testimony, I'm going to quote what he told me in an interview. He said, "On Sundays, we bathed and dressed in our best clothes. My mom dressed as if she was going to a wedding. My dad wore a suit and a tie. If someone had jewels, they wore them. And if the show was supposed to start at 6, at 3:30, we would already go to a theater. And there my parents would meet with the paisanos and go to some cafe near the theater to chat and wait for the play to start." So you can see how attending the Yiddish theater was much more than just going to see a play, an artistic event. It was rather an opportunity for social interaction and communal encounter. Moreover, during the season, the international actors settled in Buenos Aires, and the audiences were able to spend time with them outside the theater. In his autobiography, Pesach Burstein, who was so beloved in Argentina that he moved there for a few years with his wife and children, explains that in Buenos Aires, it was expected for the Yiddish actors to go to Café El Internacional after the show, so the public could applaud them and see them closer. Jewish institutions also organized banquets and dinners to welcome the stars, and all this was a big part of the enjoyment of their visits. The actor Herman Yablokov, who came to South America 6 times, describes in his autobiography the treatment the touring stars received in Buenos Aires. He says, "The heartiness displayed by the Jewish community toward visiting artists could hardly be found anywhere else. I never felt like a guest or a tourist in Buenos Aires, but rather like an old resident." So attending the theater was also a family activity in which all members participated, regardless of their age. Practically all the people that I interviewed remember that from a very young age, their parents took them to the theater, mainly because they had no one to leave them with and because the children did not pay an admission fee to the theaters. But this presence of youth in the venues transformed the Yiddish theater into a learning space for the younger generations of Jews. As the intellectual and writer Samuel Roshansky once said, I'm going to read his quote, "Many more children go to the Jewish theater than to the Jewish schools. Children who cannot write the Aleph Beis learn through a song or a play about the Kohanim, the Hasidim, the Beit HaMikdash, and hear for the first time about Gordin, Gofaden, and Sholem Aleichem." In this way, Jewish theater worked as a school of Yiddishkeit and became one of the main places where the Yiddish language, Jewish folklore, and traditions were transmitted to younger generations. Being one of the most popular activities among the Argentinian Jewish population, Yiddish theater played a fundamental role in sustaining Jewish cultural life. And it worked this way even for assimilated Jews that were already fully integrated into Argentinian society. For them, Yiddish theater remained one of the last places where they could still reconnect with their first language and culture. This way, Yiddish theater contributed to the subsistence of the Yiddish language within younger generations of Argentinian Jews. As Samuel Roshansky said, theater has an educational role for the Jewish public because night after night, they hear the Yiddish language. In this way, a large part of the Jewish youth who cannot speak it still understand it and preserve it thanks to the theater. In this sense, it's important to understand that theater could appeal to the Jewish population in ways that other Yiddish cultural expressions could not. The written word, for example, was very popular among Jewish immigrants, but it had a limitation. While there were still many Jews who could understand Yiddish, not all of them could necessarily read Yiddish. Radio was another important part of the Jewish cultural world, and the program the Yiddish Show frequently invited singers, musicians, and actors of the Yiddish theater to perform in the radio show. However, back then, most Jewish immigrants could not afford to have a radio at home. For these reasons, especially between the 30s and the 50s, the Yiddish theater was the main activity by which the immigrants and their descendants maintained and reinforced their connection to Jewish culture. And one other reason, the last reason, that could explain that phenomenon was that during the period, Yiddish theater became well known in Argentina for its artistic innovations and attracted an audience of both Jewish and non-Jewish intellectuals. Therefore, it was considered by the audiences as a place for artistic expression and not only as a form of entertainment. I believe that at the time, this functioned as an incentive for the younger and assimilated Jews to continue attending the Yiddish theater. So as you know, during this period, Yiddish theater functioned within a transnational cultural network of Yiddish-speaking communities. The Jews living in the different countries of the diaspora constituted a global audience that allowed Jewish actors to work in an itinerant way, traveling across Yiddish land. For that reason, Yiddish theater companies and artists served as a transnational conduit for dramatic repertoire and theatrical aesthetics. As a theater scholar, I was especially interested in understanding what were the artistic ideas that arrived in South America through these Jewish artists' travels, and in what way and to what extent did they influence the local theater scene. So what I argue is that Yiddish theater played a fundamental role in the modernization of the South American cultural scene. Thanks to their itinerant practice and the use of the genuinely international language of Yiddish, Jewish artists and companies brought to South America modern theatrical ideas, avant-garde aesthetics, and new repertoires that had not yet been translated into Spanish or Portuguese and were not yet widespread within South American theater circuits. Therefore, transnational Yiddish companies and itinerant artists functioned as an entryway for new artistic conceptions and contributed to disseminating modernist aesthetics and dramatic repertoires across Latin American borders. And in part, this was because the Jewish artists that arrived in South America during those years attracted great interest from the local artistic circles, even outside the Jewish community. I have examined the Argentinian and Brazilian press of the time. Here you can see some newspaper clippings. And I was very surprised by how the reviewers wrote about these Jewish actors. In many cases, the critics do not even mention that they were performing in Yiddish. And instead, they focused on their acting skills and abilities and referred to them as figures of universal theater, regardless of the language used on stage. So you can see this in these examples. In case you don't read Spanish or Portuguese, I can translate the titles. One says like Jewish actor Moy Schwartz. It arrives to Sao Paulo, a great Jewish actor, that is Jacob Benami. Then avant-garde theater, and they talk about Deborah Rosenblum and Nahum Melnik, and they say there are artists that come from the Vilna troupe, so they are European actors. And then Benami, a Jewish actor of merit. And in the bottom, you have first figures in 3 different Jewish theaters, and you have Isaac Fell and Lola Spielman, Julius and Anna Nathanson, Paul Burstein and Lilian Lux. And then in the middle, again, Paul Burstein, which is interesting because in the Spanish press, he always appears as Paul Burstein, while in the Yiddish press, he's called Pesache Burstein. So it's also a form to refer to him as an American actor. He's Paul Burstein. And it says it's a great success, a theatrical success, Paul Burstein in Buenos Aires. So this is just a few examples of the newspaper clippings in the Argentinian and Brazilian press of the time. So I believe that the Jewish impresarios were aware that the plays were also attracting audiences who didn't speak Yiddish, which can be noticed in the bilingualism of the posters of the time, where the titles appear both in Yiddish and Spanish or Portuguese. I don't know if you noticed that here you can see that it's in Spanish, some are in Yiddish and some part in Spanish, and the same here. So it was very common for the poster to have the same written in Yiddish, but also in Spanish or Portuguese. And as you can see, it was also common in this images, you can see it, that it was also common to include Spanish or Portuguese synopsis of the argument on the playbill. And this was so those who didn't understand Yiddish could follow the story. I also have found a lot of sources that show that many actors of the non-Jewish theater went to see Yiddish plays. My favorite example of the reaction is a testimony of an Argentina-based film and stage actor, Silvia Parodi. You have it there, Silvia Parodi me habla sobre Benami. So Silvia Parodi talks about Benami, and this is what she said. Benami has the gift of making himself understood without the need for language. Even without understanding a letter of the text, it is enough to contemplate his face to feel all the passions and feelings reflected. Silence, attitudes, gestures say so much that there is no need for more in order to understand and admire him. So as you can see, one of the main aspects of the Yiddish stage that attracted the non-Yiddish speakers was the performer's acting style, which was strongly influenced by the theories of the Russian actor and director Konstantin Stanislavski. At the time, Stanislavski's system was already widespread in the US and Europe, but was practically unknown in South America. Stanislavski's system intended to help the actors to develop a realistic acting style that should not be focused only on the external aspect, like the makeup or the costumes, but on the internal aspect. The performer should be able to truly feel what the character is feeling. Stanislavski called this the art of experiencing, in contrast to the art of representation. As you know, today this is the most common and popular acting style, not only in theater, but also in films and television. But at the time, it was an innovative theory. And in South America, it was still a novelty. So in Brazil, the biggest influence in this sense was the Polish actor and director Sigmund Turkov. You can see some pictures. Turkov first toured South America as a guest star in 1934. But in 1940, after the war had started, he emigrated to Argentina thanks to the help of his brother Mark Turkov, who was already living in Buenos Aires. In 1941, he traveled to perform in Brazil, where he was caught by the entrance of the country in the war. So he ended up living for a few years in Recife, where he worked in Portuguese with the Pernambuco Amateurs Theatre Group. With that company, he staged the play A Comédia do Coração by Paulo Gonçalves, which is considered the first modern production of North Brazil. Later, in 1944, he settled in Rio de Janeiro and directed the Drumkreis of BIBSA, the Biblioteca Israelita Brasileira Sholem Aleichem, so Sholem Aleichem Brazilian Jewish Library. He finally left for Israel in 1951, but by then he had already performed 18 plays with the group. Paula Ribeiro, who has written about Jewish theater in Rio de Janeiro, affirms that some testimonies mention that there were members of the theater world in Rio who, despite being unable to understand the words, would attend rehearsals, probably due to their interest in Sigmund Turkov's technique. So as Benami or Bulov, Turkov was seen by the local artistic circles as a renowned and experienced European actor and director. For this reason, he was also invited to direct local theater companies like Os Comediantes, one of the most important companies of the time in Rio de Janeiro, with whom he staged 2 plays by Brazilian authors. So By working with these local companies, he contributed to introducing to Brazil new techniques to help the actors prepare for their roles based on Stanislavski's theories. For example, he introduced at the table discussions, and you can see the image of that, the picture, that consisted in sitting around a table to discuss the text and analyze the characters before rehearsing on stage. This way of understanding the acting process was quite different from the conceptions of the time. Both Brazilian and Argentinian theater companies were typically organized around the stars and first figures, and the rest of the cast was taught to copy the main actor's style. On the contrary, Turkov encouraged the actors to understand their characters' motivations and desires, as we can see in this cast member testimony, which is great. He says, Turkov taught us to study, to read. How was the character? Why was the character like that? He would tell an actor to sit and then ask, why did you sit? And the person would answer, because you told me to. And he would say, no, you should know why your character is seated. So the character's motivation, the reason why the character is doing that. This is pure Stanislavski brought to Brazil by a Yiddish director. Another original aspect of the Yiddish theater was the use of technology that was yet uncommon in South America. In one of his visits, Moy Schwartz brought to Buenos Aires a rheostat, which allows to gradually lower or increase the intensity of light. Other Jewish artists like Herman Yavlokov also brought microphones, lights, and sound technologies that the Argentinian theaters didn't have. So the visual and sound effects on the Yiddish stage were also surprisingly advanced for the local public. The critics often praised the visual effects in, for example, Moy Schwartz's plays, and the way he used light effects to connect the different scenes as it was done in films. This was also part of some of Turkov's staging work in Brazil, which included film parts into the scenes. So by then, American and European theater was already deeply influenced by cinema aesthetics, but this was also not yet common in Argentinian or Brazilian theater. In addition to this, the repertoire that these Yiddish actors presented was also original for the local audiences that were more used to seeing melodramas, musical theater, and light comedies, which were the type of plays that prevailed in the theaters of the period. You can see some pictures of some of these plays, because instead, Yiddish artists staged plays by Henrik Ibsen, Maxim Gorky, August Strindberg, William Shakespeare, Clifford Odets, or Eugene O'Neill. Here you can see Espectros, which is Ghost by Henrik Ibsen, Hamlet, Shakespeare, and La Muerte de un Vendedor, which is Death of a Salesman by Arthur Miller. We're going to talk about that soon. So these playwrights created significant interest among Argentinian intellectuals and artists that were trying to bring European and American repertoires to Buenos Aires theaters. And a good example of the innovative character of the guest actors' repertoire was the premiere of Joseph Bullock's Death of a Salesman, so Teufel, a Salesman, which was presented in Yiddish in Buenos Aires in 1949 at the Soleil Theater. There you can see the program. This was the first time that the Argentinian public saw Arthur Miller's play. And the show was such a success that in 1950, the prominent actor Narciso Ibáñez Menta premiered a Spanish version of the play. So this event is emblematic of the Yiddish theater operating as a modernizing force that deeply influenced the larger theater scene. And you can notice that these programs are completely in Spanish. I don't see any Yiddish, right? So you can see how this was meant to bring the attention of the non-Yiddish speakers that were going to see this play, but often went to see this place. So, of course, it was not all literary plays and modern art aesthetics. Two countervailing tendencies existed in the Yiddish theaters of America. One of art theater, based on literary works that came either from universal theater or from the Jewish repertoire, right, plays by Sholem Asch, Perez Hirschfein, Leivik, Ayer Perez, Sholem Aleichem. And on the other hand, a more popular theater comprising operettas, melodramas, and vaudeville, whose main purpose was to entertain and that were extremely popular within the Jewish public. You're also probably wondering about local Yiddish dramatists, but sadly I have to say that the South American theater didn't really have many Yiddish theater authors, which is something that can be easily explained. As I said, the local Yiddish theater truly depended on the star system and needed the visits of foreign stars to sustain the theater season. And when the stars came, they brought their own repertoire that they already know and that they had previously staged in other places. So apart from a few exceptions, the local authors had almost no chance to get their plays performed in the professional Jewish theaters. Among these exceptions, I can mention the play Goles by Mordechai Alperson, which premiered in 1926. Also, The Jewish Prince of Patagonia by Jacobo Liachowicki, which premiered in 1919. And the play Sisi Egoi by Samuel Glasserman, presented in 1930 by Samuel Goldenberg, which, as far as I know, was the only time that a visiting star performed a play by a local Yiddish author. So for these reasons, the critics often complain that the star system was to be blamed for the absence of a true local Yiddish theater. They also claim that the impresarios spoiled the audience by constantly giving them new names and faces, which finally made the public care more about the actors than about the plays. The polemic was such that there were even trials to decide if the star system was beneficial or if it was an obstacle to the development of a local Yiddish theater. And the problem was not only artistic, but economic. Local actors lacked financial stability as they depended on touring stars. For these reasons, in 1932, local actors instituted an actors' union, the Yiddish Verein, in Spanish, La Sociedad de Actores Israelitas en Argentina. You can see here a picture of Jacob Benami with some members of the Verein, and then an event of the Verein and the Verein's statute. We are going to go through some of the rules of the statutes soon. So later, the Uruguayan Yiddish actors were also included in the Verein. So it became the Sociedad de Actores Israelitas en Argentina y Uruguay, right? So Argentina and Uruguay. In Brazil, there were several attempts to create a union, but none of them lasted as long as the Argentinian one. The Verein's statute established a number of rules for impresarios that were intended to improve the working conditions of theater employees. A minimum salary was established and a minimum number of cast members. It also required the local actor contracts had to be signed for at least 6 months, while foreign stars contracts could not exceed 3 months. Companies were also not allowed to hire more than 3 foreign stars per season. Regulations also stipulated that a percentage of foreign star salaries had to be paid to the Verein. So this guaranteed that at least part of the profits of the Argentinian Jewish theater was used to improve the living conditions of local actors. With the success of the Verein's regulations, plus the rising anti-Semitism in Europe and then later the war, many former guest stars began settling permanently in South America during the 30s. Among them were dramatic actors such as Salomon and Clara Stramer, Sina Rappel and her family, Esther Perlman and Itzhak Deitch in Brazil, but also actors and musicians who specialize in Kleinkunst, as Max Perelman and Gita Galina or Hebel Katz. These Jewish artists brought to Argentina the cabaret style in its Jewish form and contributed to the development of the couplet genre in Buenos Aires. Hebel Katz, which is the one in the right, became so famous in Argentina that he was called the Jewish Gardel after the famous Argentinian tango singer. So at the same time, During this period, the local Yiddish theater scene began to grow thanks to the establishment of amateur Yiddish theater companies. In Argentina, the most important and long-lasting company was the IFT, which is Iddischer Volkstheater, Jewish People's Theater, Teatro Popular Judío in Spanish, which was created in 1932. It was founded by members of Jewish workers' clubs and amateur theater circles who wanted to stage literary plays that address social matters. Later, the IFT became part of the Argentinian branch of the ICUF, the Jiddischer Kulturverband, or Jewish Culture Association, which unified all the left-wing Jewish institutions of Argentina. The IFT company functioned until the late 60s, when almost all the other Yiddish theaters were already closed. And this was mainly because in 1957, the IFT decided to start performing in Spanish instead of Yiddish. So that's one of the reasons why it lasted longer than the rest of the theaters. And nowadays, this is the only remaining Yiddish theater building that still exists in Buenos Aires, as you can see in the picture, the before and after picture. And as you can see, it's still a theater. So if you ever visit Buenos Aires in the future, you can go there to see a play. It won't be a Yiddish play, but it's still a theater. It still works as a theater. So back then, the IFT goal was to build a theater company of local actors that would have a strong aesthetic and political commitment. They believed that in order to sustain an art theater company, it was essential to, one, be free of the star system, creating instead an ensemble-based company. Two, to stage new and original literary plays coming from Jewish literary tradition and universal dramaturgy. Three, to have professional directors who could bring modern artistic conceptions to the Jewish stage. And four, to build a solid financial base that could guarantee the economic support of the theater. To fulfill these purposes, in 1936, they established a committee, Pro Teatro Popular Israelita in Buenos Aires, so for a people's Yiddish theater in Buenos Aires. It was to gather the funds to sustain a permanent theater. The campaign was deeply successful. Within 2 months, the theater achieved the initial goal of 500 members, and by 1957, they already had 5,000 members. So you can see the membership card of the IFT theater, and membership entailed monthly contributions that freed the company from dependence on ticket sales. So the IFT members wanted to be independent of the box office because they believed that only in this way they could take artistic risk and bring new aesthetics and authors to the stage. So a good example of the importance that Buenos Aires Jews attached to the theater was the campaign for the construction of a playhouse for the IFT. In 1945, the IFT began to gather the funds for the project. In 1946, the construction began, and you can see the picture of that. And by 1952, the building was already finished, and the IFT became the first and only Jewish company in Buenos Aires to have its own theater. Once the building was opened, the IFT introduced new activities to satisfy the cultural needs of the community. They organized music concerts and conferences every week, and over the years, they added a drama school, a choir, a library, a cinema club, a ballet and a theater school for children, a puppetry company, an art gallery, and even a chess club. So the IFT became more than a theater. It became a true cultural center for the Jewish community of Buenos Aires. During most of its history, the IFT's artistic director was David Licht, as we say it in Argentina, it could be David Licht or David Licht, who was an actor and director who had been part of the Vilna troupe and Piat, the Parisian Yiddish avant-garde theater. Under Licht's guidance, the IFT staged many plays from the Yiddish repertoire, but also premiere European and American plays in Yiddish translation, such as, for example, The Lower Deck, a lot of speaking in English, talking in English is tiring for a Spanish speaker. So which one were these repertoire? For example, these European American plays in Yiddish translation, for example, The Lower Desk by Maxim Gorky, All Got Children Got Wings by Eugene O'Neill, and All My Sons by Arthur Miller. These are some of the examples. So the IFT also premiered in 1953, the first Bertolt Brecht play to be staged in Argentina by a local theater, which was Madre Coraje, Mother Courage, translated from German into Yiddish. You can see the program of the performance and a picture of All My Sons by Arthur Miller. This is a play from 1950. This was directed by David Licht. And with Mother Courage, it happened something similar than with Death of a Salesman, because the members of the famous Argentinian company Nuevo Teatro, New Theater, staged the same Bertolt Brecht piece just 1 year later, but this time in Spanish. So Licht also brought to the company a realistic acting style through Stanislavski's theories. Stanislavski's writings were not published in Spanish until the 1950s, when his theory became popular in Argentina. However, many of the chapters of his books were published first in the IFT journal, Night Theater, New Theater, in Yiddish translations. And Licht itself wrote many articles about Stanislavski's system in this magazine. So as Turkov, Licht was also invited to direct one of the most important Argentinian independent theater companies of the time, La Máscara. Here you can see a picture of Licht with the cast of La Máscara, which means the mask. And he staged William Shakespeare Macbeth in Spanish. This is a really famous performance of Macbeth that it was in Argentina, directed by David Licht. So the IFT was also one of the first theater companies to establish in 1947 a dramatic school to train new generations of actors in the realistic acting style. That way, the IFT contributed to spreading Stanislavski's system within the Argentinian theater scene. Lastly, the last example, the IFT developed an ensemble-based aesthetic in opposition to the individualistic theater that prevailed in Buenos Aires theaters, which gravitated around the stars. In this sense, the IFT followed the guidelines of the European art theaters that emphasize the work of the ensemble over the individual figures. As you can see in the pictures of the play, how they work in this ensemble aesthetic. The IFT ensemble aesthetic is another example of an original theatrical conception that was first developed in the Yiddish theater and that later influenced other Argentinian theater companies. Brazil also had important Yiddish amateur troupes that, as the IFT, were linked to the Jewish progressive left-wing movement. I'm going to show you some pictures. I already mentioned the Drumkreis of the Sholem Aleichem Library, in which Turkov participated. And then in Sao Paulo, there was the Drumkreis of the Centro Cultura Progreso, which later became the Instituto Cultural Israelita Brasileiro, also called Casa do Povo, so People's House. And this theater group was founded in 1944, and for many years it was directed by Jacob Rothbaum, who was part of the Vilna troupe and previously also directed the IFT theater. So in this new project that I'm starting, I'll be exploring the connections between these three left-wing theater companies. So to conclude, what happened with the Yiddish theater in South America? In the mid-50s, it started experiencing a progressive decrease in Yiddish plays that finally led to the decline of the Yiddish theater scene during the 60s. Multiple reasons can explain this decay. I'm going to try to summarize. One of the main problems that the Yiddish theater faced was the absence of youth, both among the public and on the stage. Most of the young Jewish actors whose first language was now Spanish or Portuguese left the Yiddish theater companies to work in the national theater, film, and television. Another problem was the absence of new plays in the Yiddish theater repertoire. As we have seen, South American Yiddish theater relied not only on the visits of the guest stars, but also on the repertoires they brought. So when they stopped coming and Yiddish theater started declining all over the world, it became difficult for the local Yiddish theaters to offer novelty to the public. The theaters kept presenting the same now elderly actors and the same plays that were popular during the golden era, but that now seemed outdated for the new generations of Jews. On the other hand, there was a problem of the language used on the stage. So the adoption of Hebrew as Israel's official language was a turning point for the Yiddish culture in South America, because after 1948, the Hebrew began to replace Yiddish as a second language in Jewish schools, so even fewer young people could understand the plays. And lost too was Yiddish heymigkeit, the feeling of being at home, that previous generations felt when they attended the theater. So the Yiddish theater was no longer seen as a place where the Jewish public could find artistic innovations, and it was neither a place where the Jewish youth could feel at home, as it had been for the previous generations. So what happened is that, as the Jewish literary magazine Patch observed, this is a quote, "Every Jew who passes away leaves an empty seat in the Soleil Theater." Remember, the Soleil Theater was one of the biggest Yiddish theaters in Buenos Aires. So every Jew who passes away leaves an empty seat in this Yiddish theater. So when they start to lose the audience, the professional theaters began to close. And as I mentioned, the independent and amateur Jewish theater companies continue working until the late 60s, but by then they were only performing in Spanish or Portuguese. However, even if this Yiddish theater scene disappeared, it left a big mark on South American culture. As I have shown, Yiddish theater served as an entryway for new artistic conceptions and theatrical ideas that contributed to the modernization of the South American theater scene. Also, Yiddish theater helped to consolidate Jewish identity in the South American diasporic context by maintaining the immigrants' connection to the rest of the Jewish cultural world, and at the same time, function as a proof of the Jewish contribution to South American culture. For that reason, Yiddish theater should not be only remembered as a powerful manifestation of Jewish culture, but also as a vital part of South American cultural history. So thank you so much for listening. I hope the presentation was interesting for you. And of course, I'd be happy to answer any questions or just hear your comments. Thank you so much.
Hi, thank you so much, Paula. That was really, really fascinating. I learned a lot that I really wasn't aware of, in particular, this aspect that you emphasized on the innovations that Yiddish theater brought to general Argentine theater. I think, that's so fascinating. And I'm just wondering if, obviously this was central to your research, or a central theme in your research, but I'm wondering if South American or Argentine historians of theater recognize this, and they don't. So please tell me. I'm really fascinated by this.
No, I love this question because this is the main reason why I got into this topic. Because it basically non-Argentinian history books, like history of theater in Argentina books, even mention this. Maybe a line, maybe a small reference, but nothing else. So I'm a theater scholar, I'm a theater historian. So when I was starting to work thinking about my PhD research topic, what my dissertation was going to be about, and I realized that this was a thing, right? That this existed because my family went to Yiddish theater, my grandma was always talking about this, and everyone in the Jewish community remember this history with a lot of love, and they were very proud of the Yiddish theater scene, the Jewish theater scene in Buenos Aires. But then in the world of the theater scholars, Argentinian historians, they had no idea about this. So this was actually my motivation to start this research topic and to write my dissertation about the Buenos Aires Jewish theater scene and to focus on these influences. And I this is what I try to prove in my dissertation. And now, like every time I go to a conference or anything, I'm the person that tries to show that this was an important chapter in Argentinian theater history. And what I'm now trying to do is trying to prove that it was also important in other South American countries like Brazil, Chile, and Uruguay. So this is my new task for the future, to prove that.
It's great.
It's hypothesis.
Yeah, it's so fascinating to learn that it was really so innovative and important. I wonder if you could go back a bit further and maybe sort of briefly describe the origins of Yiddish theater in let's say just Buenos Aires, since that's I think the largest center. I'm just sort of curious how is it, before the star system began, or maybe it began with the star system, just because like sort of the very earliest traces of theater and what that was like.
No, actually it began in 1901. So that's the first like record of a Yiddish performance. It was El Tartamudo. That was the translation, which is Dispei Kunilemu, but it was translated as El Tartamudo. And this was the first play. And there was a lot of Yiddish theater plays in those decades, like between the beginning of 20th century and 1930. But the golden era began in 1930, because it's when most stars started coming to Argentina. And also there's another thing that is maybe a polemic topic in Argentinian history that I didn't mention, that is the connection between the Yiddish theater in South America, not only in Argentina, but also in Brazil, and the prostitution network, the Spimigdal. There are a lot of sources that show that the Jewish, like the Spimigdal, in a way, they were the people that bought the tickets for this place in the beginning. So they were the ones sustaining the theater in this first decade. And there were a lot of polemics in terms of this, because the families didn't want to go to a theater because of the prostitutes were there and the pimps and etc. So in 1926, finally, they were like banned from the theaters. This was like the date, 1926, when the theaters start showing posters that said like they are not allowed in the theater.
Oh.
And then in 1930, the Spimigdal was dissolved. So then the Yiddish theater was free from all suspicion of this connection between the Yiddish theater and the prostitution network. It's a polemic topic. I'm simplifying it a lot, but the fact is that this idea that the Yiddish theater was connected with the prostitution network discredit the Yiddish theater. So a lot of people, intellectuals, artists, the families didn't want to attend the Yiddish theater because of these ideas. I don't know how true they were, but it was what people thought. So 1930s, when the Yiddish theater began, start being a place for families and also a place for this artistic new trends and new aesthetics. So the intellectuals and the artists start attending the Yiddish theater. And that was interested me.
Right. No, but this backstory of Tzvi Migdal, supporting them early on is fascinating. This is also probably something that probably should not be written out of history.
Completely, yeah. And if you're interested, you probably know Tova Markinson. She's one of the people she's focusing on that period of this connection between the Spimigdal and the Yiddish theater. So if you can find some of her writings, probably you can learn a little bit more about this topic.
Thank you. Wow, really, really interesting. All right, let's get to some questions from the audience.
Sure.
Here's an interesting question from Kosti Shapiro-Chorin, who's wondering if you're aware of any examples where Yiddish troops coming from abroad adjusted their repertoire in terms of content or themes in order to make the plays more relatable to South American audiences?
I don't think it was the case. Maybe there are some examples that I am not aware of, but they were bringing these repertoires that they already know, that they already have like staged in different places. So of course it was adapted in the sense that the local actors, the cast was built by local actors. So in some sense, it was probably different from other places, but I don't think they adapted the plays. And they made the local actors rehearse for so many hours. There are a million anecdotes about this, that Moy Schwartz would rehearse for like 20 hours straight, nonstop, you know, like during the night, because they didn't have enough time to prepare for the presentations. So the local actors were exhausted trying to keep up with these stars, these guest stars.
Right. Interesting. I mean, in connection to that question, I'm also wondering if, you know, you said that the sort of the dominant type of performance were these performances, plays that were brought from abroad with these stars, and that there was a smaller number of local plays written. You know, were there any kind of big hits that were sort of locally based and that sort of showed, you know, kind of a performance of local, you know, Argentine Jews or South American Jews?
Yeah, I don't think there were hits. There were some plays staged, but I don't think there were the hits were really the local plays. Yes, in Spanish. For example, the IFT Theater, they premiered a play called Requiem para un Viernes a la Noche. If there are any Argentinians in the audience, they probably will know it, which was a huge success, really important play for Argentinian theater history that was performed by the IFT Theater, the Yiddish Volkstheater, but it was in Spanish. So it was a local Jewish writer, but that was writing in Spanish, not in Yiddish. So it's probably different.
Right. Okay, let's see. David Fisher asks if there's a South American equivalent of Artef producing socially conscious plays. I think you went over that with IFT. This was a socially conscious organization.
And they admire Artef a lot. It was like a role model for the IFT. They look up for Artef.
Right. And Holly Rosenberg asks if Boris Tomaszewski ever performed, and the question was answered by Zachary Baker, who's also in the audience, and does that Boris Tomaszewski toured Argentina in 1924 and wrote about it in the Vorwärts.
He also Zachary wrote about Samuel Goldenberg's performance when he staged Sisiegoi by Samuel Glasserman, which is a local Yiddish author. So that's probably also interesting. You can find that, I think, in Digital Yiddish Theater Project.
Right. And someone is, Claudia asks, talks about Itzik Feld, who was her Bubby's cousin. And it was a big deal every time every time he visited Buenos Aires. And she writes that Pesach Geburstein writes in What a Life, that it was very hard to act with Feld as there was a lot of competition between them. There were immigrants in New York, but in Buenos Aires, they had the chance to be stars. And she asked if there was more collaboration in the American theater. I guess collaboration between the two of them, she's asking. I don't know. Maybe this is not entirely clear. Maybe clear that up.
But maybe she's referring to an anecdote that Pesach tells in his autobiography about these rivalries between the guest stars. And you actually, in one of the pictures that I show, that you can see three first figures of three different Jewish theater. And there you have Feld, and you have Pesach Geburstein, and they were working together in the American theater, but then when they came to Argentina, they were playing different theaters, so they were competing with each other, and this created all sorts of rivalries. Pesach Geburstein autobiography is beautiful, it's full with anecdotes, it's so funny to read, so it's something that I recommend to every Yiddish theater enthusiastic, and he tells a lot of like juicy gossip about the South American Yiddish theater scene, so that's another recommendation if you like that type of things.
Okay, great. And lastly, David Fisher asks if the Perón government supported the Yiddish theater or if they had a particular stance on Jewish issues.
It's a complicated question that I also cannot answer in like a few minutes, but there was no issue between Perón and the Yiddish theater or Jewish theater. There was an issue with the IFT theater. The theater was closed during the last period of the second government of the presidential of Perón, but this was mainly because it was a communist theater. This is my interpretation. Of course, this can be argued, but I think they was closed for almost 2 years because of this left-wing politics, because it was a communist theater and not because it was a Jewish theater. But this maybe some people can disagree with me. This is my personal position, and it obviously is really complicated to go into details now.
Right. All right. Unfortunately, we're out of time. But thank you so much, Paula. This was incredibly fascinating, and thanks to everyone who attended. If you missed any of it, this lecture was recorded and will be on our YIVO's YouTube site. Once again, this has been the Ruth and Joseph Kremen Memorial Fellowship lecture at the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research. If you liked what you saw, please consider making a donation to YIVO. We can't provide these lectures without your support. So please consider that. And once again, please join me in thanking Paula Ansaldo for her wonderful lecture. And have a good day.
Thank you.